Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversation is a podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about the interesting work on various aspects of Nepal. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting contemporary Nepali society. The theme for Nepal Conversations' second season is gender. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of gender and sexuality and what it means for Nepal.
Our guest today is Jessica Vantine Birkenholtz, who is an Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Asian Studies at Pennsylvania State University. She specializes in women, gender, and religion in South Asia, particularly in Hindu societies and cultures, and especially in Nepal, where she has worked for 2 decades. Her book, Reciting the Goddess, Narratives of Place and the Making of Hinduism in Nepal, won the 2019 American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the Textual Studies category. This book presents an archival and ethnographic study of Nepal's local goddess Swasthani, the widely read Swasthanivratakatha, and the role both the goddess and the text have played in the construction of Nepali Hindu identity and practice. A second new book project draws on her broader interests in gender and religion to present an ethnographic, intersectional study of the queer community in Nepal. This project uses religion as its primary lens and attends to the intersections of religion, secularism, ethnicity, and queerness in modern Nepal.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Jessica. We're very pleased to have you with us today. You have worked on Nepal since past 2 decades on religion and gender. How did you come to work in the country and why on these subjects?
Well, first off, thank you so much, Uma and Kumud, for inviting me to be here today and to share a little bit about my research on religion and gender in Nepal. I really appreciate the conversation that we're going to have. So in terms of how I came to Nepal and to study what it is that I study, my first experience in Nepal was in 1996 as a study abroad student through the School for International Training study abroad program. And I had just an incredible experience during that semester abroad and had no idea at the time that all sorts of seeds were being planted that were going to change kind of the trajectory of my life and career. You know, I saw it as an experience to go abroad. I did not know that this was going to become a career for me. And so kind of the main thing about that study abroad experience is that for our independent study project, at the end of that semester, we had this month-long project that we could decide what to study. And it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to look at. There were so many interesting things. You know, I was so captivated by pretty much everything that I was experiencing and learning in Nepal. And ultimately, I came across a reference to the goddess Swastani and the Swasthanivratakatha in Lynn Bennett's Dangerous Wives, Sacred Sisters book, which is still available and widely used in Nepal. And my curiosity was piqued and I became really interested in Swastani and the tradition. Kind of long story short, I spent that final month of that study abroad program in a small village in Western Nepal, talking with people, trying to learn about the Swastani tradition. And again, little did I know that this was planting a seed that would come to bear all sorts of fruits down the road, because I eventually went to graduate school. And this was after I'd graduated from college. I had a fellowship to go back to Nepal for a year to study women's traditions. And I looked at Tej and Sita Bibaha Panchami and the Swastani, among others. And had decided that I wanted to go to graduate school to study religion and South Asia as well, and really Hinduism broadly, but Hinduism specifically in Nepal, with a focus on women's traditions therein. And kind of in the early part of my graduate work, it became very obvious to me that when studying South Asia and when studying Hinduism, Nepal was really left out of the conversations because in at least American scholarship, Euro-American scholarship. South Asia generally means India. Hinduism generally means India. And as someone who had recently fallen in love with Nepal, I saw this as a glaring oversight and really wanted to bring Nepal into the conversation. And again, kind of longer story short, I ended up focusing on the Swastani tradition for my doctoral dissertation. And so kind of the seed that had been planted as an undergraduate started to bear some fruits. It was a very exciting project to me because here was this goddess and textual tradition that was so widely known and revered in Nepal, but really not known, completely unknown outside of Nepal. And even within Nepal, very little was known about the history and development of the goddess tradition and the textual tradition. I was also really excited about using different languages. I've always enjoyed studying languages, and at that point had been studying Sanskrit for several years, had learned Nepali in Nepal, and was excited to think about learning Newar, Nepal Bhasa, in order to study the Swastani as well. So incorporated languages, incorporated texts. It was a living tradition that focused on women, which was really exciting to me. And kind of this overarching questions that I had about an interest about looking at how ancient and medieval texts and the ideologies that they extol survive into the modern world, and what forms they take and how they're challenged and so on in a modern context. And so the Swastani tradition really encapsulated all of this in really amazing sorts of ways. And so I did that for my dissertation, which eventually became my first book. And through my work on Svasthani and the Svasthanivratakatha, I became more and more invested in the study of goddesses and goddess traditions, which opened up even more discussions about women and gender, and kind of broadened that into a larger conversation for me. And more so then as that work has brought me more and more into the contemporary period, because much of that Swasthanivratakatha work that I'll have occasion to talk more about, I think, was really textual historical. And so that work brought me eventually into the contemporary period and more into ethnographic work. And so my interest in women and religion has broadened to think more about gender and sexuality in Hinduism and in Nepal, both within and beyond the Newar and Bau and Kshatriya communities that are most closely associated with the Swastani tradition. So that's a very, to me, short version of how I came to focus on religion and gender in Nepal.
Thanks, Jessica. This is really exciting. And we'll ask you more questions about the goddess later on. But to start with your work in general, because your work focuses on the intersection of Hindu ideology, identity and practice, and gender in Kathmandu. What can we learn by reflecting on the role of religion within gender studies or studies on identities?
So I think if we understand gender as a social construct rather than as biologically determined, then we really need to consider all of the social and cultural influences and forces that bear upon notions and articulations of gender, including caste and class, for example, but also religion. And we also need to understand that religion too is a social construct that does not always mean the same thing or look the same way to different people in different places. And the importance of taking religion into consideration and its impact in understanding gender is all the greater, I think, in cultures that continue to be deeply entrenched in or influenced by religious ideology and practice. So which is to say, cultures that have not yet been influenced or transformed through the process of secularization. And much of South Asia falls into that category. And Nepal in particular, I think still does, for even though they're officially secular, specifically much of Nepal's population has not yet been meaningfully touched by secularization. And similarly, for many of Nepal's ethnic groups, their ethnic identity is defined, at least in part, by their religious beliefs, all of which then informs their views on gender. And while feminist scholars of religion have been keenly aware for a long time of the importance of using a feminist lens to view and rethink sacred texts and religious language, ideology, and practices, and so on. Feminists more broadly and women's studies and queer studies scholars often dismiss religion as a central axis of difference in defining gender in different cultures and contexts. And this might be in part a legacy of what some would call white feminism that privileges feminist concerns and challenges of white Euro-American women, and kind of, so there's a need to broaden out the conversation beyond kind of white feminism to think about what feminism looks like in other places. And I would argue that thinking about religion is, again, very central to these cultures, where it remains an important point of reference in daily lived practices, and subjectivity and how people identify. And although kind of Hinduism and Buddhism historically in Nepal have not been something that has been a leading identifier, right? So one would often identify, for example, as Newar before identifying as Hindu or Buddhist, for example. But nevertheless, kind of even in those ethnic identities, there are religious influences that are important, right? And kind of those religious and cultural practices are informing the ways in which men and women and non-binary people, gender non-conforming people are identifying and interacting in the world. And so it's all part of the same conversation. And from my perspective, as a feminist scholar of religion, it's important to acknowledge religion as an axis of difference in thinking about articulations of gender and gender ideology.
So you mentioned ethnic identities being tied to religion and how the identities themselves are influenced by the different religions that ethnic groups in Nepal follow. Could you give us an example of that and what you mean by that? And is that true for many of the ethnic groups, all of the ethnic groups, or are you talking about specific ethnic groups?
First off, I would say that a couple of things. I'm not speaking necessarily, I'm speaking very broadly in that regard, but also recognize that it's very complicated and dangerous to make any sweeping generalizations, right? And one of the things that in general in my work that I try and do is be very attentive to articulating which community I'm speaking about at any given time. So when I talk about religion being important for different ethnic groups, I don't necessarily have a specific example in my mind, but more just a general idea that every ethnic group has their own worldview, right? And these can be overlapping with one another. And many of Nepal's ethnic groups have kind of adopted a Hindu perspective and worldview for often economic or political reasons over the centuries that are advantageous to the ethnic groups. But, particularly kind of during the period of identity politics and the identity politics movement that really erupted in the mid-2000s in the wake of the Maoist war and the fall of the Hindu monarchy, right? A lot of ethnic groups were looking to articulate their identities as ethnic groups. And I'm by no means, my work has focused most specifically on the Newar community and kind of secondarily on the Bao and Chetri community. So I'm not an authority on any other ethnic group or even on those ethnic groups for that matter. But my understanding, right, is that they each are going to have a way of looking at the world, and whether or not we would call those, religions that are specific to each one of them, I don't think it's again, this idea of using religion is complicated because religion is a Western Abrahamic concept that doesn't map onto non-Abrahamic traditions very readily, right? And so thinking about kind of religion among these different ethnic groups is a bit of a misnomer. But the general idea that I'm getting at is that every ethnic group has its own perspective. They have their own mythology. And again, these might be shared and the lines might be blurred, right? None of these are necessarily in silos, setting them apart from others. Nepal, as you well know, is these communities and these cultures are overlapping and integrating and melting in and out of one another in a lot of ways, while also at different times trying to make themselves distinct from one another. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that it's important to recognize that, that different ethnic communities are going to have different perspectives on gender, and that is likely going to be part of a larger conversation about how they position themselves in the world in kind of everyday terms, but also in more metaphysical terms.
You mentioned earlier about your book on the goddess Svasthani, which was published in 2018 and titled Reciting the Goddess, Narratives of Place and the Making of Hinduism in Nepal. Can you tell us a bit more about the goddess, and why has the Swasthanikatha been so popular, especially among some groups in Nepal?
I can talk about Swastani till I'm blue in the face, but I will try and keep these comments short for the sake of the current conversation. So in thinking about maybe just a little bit about the history of the tradition and kind of its role. So the Swasthanivratakatha originated, as far as we can tell, in 1573 CE, which is 693 Nepal Samvat. This is the oldest manuscript that we have, and all indications suggest that there was not, the tradition really began to expand after this. And it was exclusively transmitted among Newars for the first several hundred years until the early 19th century, when it was translated into Nepali. And since then, both Newars and Prabhatiya Hindus claim the tradition as their own, and for good reason, I think, or I would argue. And the Kathmandu Valley has really historically been the home of the Swastani tradition. So I've met Nepalis from the Terai and Western Nepal, as well as ethnic Nepalis in Darjeeling and Sikkim, who are familiar with the tradition as well. And one of the things that has always struck me about the tradition is that neither the goddess Swastani nor the Svasthanivratakatha really had any currency outside of Nepal. And kind of given the flow of culture and religion and gods and goddesses in South Asia, this was very striking, right? And this has changed really only recently, around 2013, when the first Swastani temple was built in India. And interestingly, and also purely coincidentally, this Indian temple was built nearly contemporaneously with the first temple to Swastani in Nepal, which is the magnificent temple in Sanku on the outskirts of the valley. And so it's really a Hindu tradition, specifically for Newars and Parvatiya Hindus. And as for why it's been so popular, I think there's a combination of reasons that include more mundane reasons, such as it being historically a way to pass the cold winter months, right? Long before television and computers and smartphones, before longer commuting hours and things like that, it was a great way to sit around warming coals and to share a story, right, as a family. But more importantly, I also think that this is a local narrative that articulates a local worldview and honored a local goddess, the goddess literally of one's own place, which could be interpreted so widely. And for that reason, I think it resonated widely. And even as the text changed and expanded, which I can say more about, it served really to situate the listener, the devotee, within their immediate context of family, home, and village, but also within the broader context of Nepal and kind of the Hindu world most broadly. So although perhaps not as action-packed as, say, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, many Nepalis have told me over the years that the Svasthanivratakatha has more meaning and currency in Nepal than either of those epics do. So I think that it has kind of this storytelling capacity, and kind of its localness, which is curiously also becomes very translocal throughout its history and expansion. But I would offer up those as some initial reasons that help us understand how the tradition became so popular and how it's been sustained and why it's been sustained for so long.
You also say that the text has changed and expanded. So how has the Swastani Katha changed over the years, and has the goddess changed as well?
So let me start with the goddess. The goddess has not changed that much, actually, which is really interesting. And in part, this is because I would say historically, Swastani was an aniconic deity, meaning that unlike so many other deities in the Hindu pantheon, she historically did not have an image that was physically manifested, right? She's described very much in detail in the Swasthanivratakatha, but her image did not grace temples or statues or paintings, right? And so, for example, there really have only been 3 known images, statues, murti, of the goddess Swastani throughout her history. One is from the 17th century, 2 are from the 17th century, only 1 still exists today, and the 3rd is from the early 21st century. And so hers is an aniconic tradition historically. But that said, you know, there were also very few drawings of her, but there were a few. And so her iconography did experience a pretty major shift in her tradition somewhat early on, insofar as in the Svasthanivratakatha, the text describes her as being seated next to Shiva, basically in consort fashion. But eventually, and kind of in the very few early drawings that we have of her, that is how she is indeed drawn, as seated next to Shiva. But not very long afterwards, Shiva is no longer featured in these iconographic representations of Swastani, and instead she assumes the form that she is so widely known today, which is seated in the middle of the Astamatrika, the 8 mother goddesses, on an 8-petal lotus leaf. So that's a really interesting kind of shift that is not, there's no kind of explanation for it in the text itself. The Astamatrika do not feature in the text really historically. So there's, you know, some interesting aspects to that that I would argue hearken to kind of Shakti influences and kind of the positioning of the goddess Swastani as both a protector deity, but also a deity to be protected. Also, one other kind of interesting thing about the goddess is that her physical presence in the Svasthanivratakatha narrative does exist in the earliest Svasthanivratakatha texts, but pretty quickly that is removed from the text and she does no longer physically manifest in the narrative, even though she's kind of omnipresent throughout. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of the goddess and changes as far as she's concerned. And as for the text itself, the narrative, that experienced much more change over the years. Specifically, it underwent 3 major shifts that expanded the narrative from what started as an 8-folio palm leaf local folk legend to a several 100-page printed Purana text. And for anyone who's read the Swastani knows that the story now begins literally at the beginning of time with creation, moves through the divine pantheon and a couple series of Shiva tales about Shiva, Sati Devi, and Parvati, and then into the local legend. So the original story in the oldest Swasthanivratakatha text was just the local legend about Gomaju, Chandrawati, and Navaraj. And that eventually became limited to the last third of the modern Swastani text. And I argue in my book that these textual developments and expansions occurred in response to local and regional social and political developments through which the ruling elite and the religious actors propelling the tradition navigated and articulated Nepali Hindu identity vis-a-vis Indian Hindu identity.
You were talking about how the Swasthanivratakatha changed, how the text changed into a Puranic text earlier. And you mentioned how that was influenced by local and regional changes, political changes. Can you quickly tell us a bit more on that, what you have in the book?
Sure. So, so what I argue in the book is that there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between these major shifts in the textual narrative development of the Svasthanivratakatha and the things that were happening in the political and social landscape of Nepal and South Asia more broadly. But if we look at the timing and the nature of these three shifts in the text and when they were occurring and what was happening at that time, we can see some interesting correlations that, in short, suggest that Nepal was, kind of throughout its history or throughout the history of the Swastani development. So this is really kind of mid 18th century up to the early 20th century, but really kind of mid 18th and 19th century, was kind of coming into its own in terms of articulating and defining itself as a Hindu kingdom and defining itself as a Hindu, having a Hindu identity, right? And we see that in the text insofar as we go from this local legend to then suddenly incorporating in these Puranic narratives that are mainly the Shaiva stories, but then also include these creation narratives that really expand the notion, the world beyond this local legend and this local goddess. So suddenly we go from the local to these translocal Puranic deities and myths, right? The creation of the universe and the divine world. So we're taken away from the immediate local context and taken back to the beginning of time into this translocal context. And kind of what I argue in the book is that this reflects this broader trend that was happening at that time among Nepal's ruling elite, and that this was kind of a lay articulation or reaction to these, higher level conversations and negotiations of what it meant to be Hindu and of defining Nepali Hinduism and Nepali Hindu identity vis-a-vis Indian Hinduism and Indian Hindu identity. And so kind of saying, what is Nepali about us as Hindus and what is not, and we're both very local, and this is our local goddess, but we're also part of this larger Hindu world, right? And in many ways, if we look at some of Nepal's, I'll try and keep this really brief. If we look at some of Nepal's other local Puranic literature, so the Pashupati Purana, the Nepal Mahatmya, and the Himavad Khanda, we move from the Pashupatinath, right, as a sacred place, very small and local, to then the Nepal Mahatmya, which broadens out from Pashupati to Nepal and glorifying Nepal, to then Himavad Khanda. And so suddenly we go from Nepal to an even broader region of the Himalayas. And in this, so that too is reflecting this kind of broadening notion of situating Nepal within this broader sacred region, right? And the Swastani is very much part of that conversation of expanding notions of Hindu identity from within kind of the local sphere and everyday experience to thinking more broadly about Nepal as a Hindu kingdom and part of this larger Hindu world.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. We were reading some of your articles, which are really interesting as well. And in your 2019 article titled "On Becoming a Woman: Shakti Storytelling and Women's Roles and Rights in Nepal," you talk about storytelling and this process of what you describe as recreating certain ways of being generation after generation. But you also talk about different interpretation of Shakti in that article. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how this might relate to different understandings of women's empowerment or agency?
First of all, I had a really fun time working on that article. And kind of an important question that leads to your question is, how has the narrative around the Svasthanivratakatha tradition changed? So not the narrative, not the Swastani narrative itself, but the narrative around the tradition as a whole. And this is really what motivated me to write that article. So as I was finishing my book on the Svasthanivratakatha tradition, which focused on the history and development of the tradition, this opened up new spaces for me to think about the tradition in new ways, and specifically in the contemporary period, and to tune into conversations and discussions about how the Swastani tradition was being received and significantly rejected by different Nepali women. And as a living tradition, again, one of the aspects of the Swastani tradition that intrigued me the most is that it is this living tradition that has a continuous unbroken history from the late 16th century up to the present day, which is no minor feat, I might add, and is really one of the few of Nepal's kind of locally authored kind of Nepali original texts that got out of the realm of priests and pundits into the lay realm and was taken up and developed and thrived well into the modern period, right up to the present day. So as a living tradition, the contemporary reception of the text is significant. And as it happens, as I started to kind of tune into these conversations more, when I was thinking a little bit less about the history of it and more about the contemporary life of it, I was hearing more and more increasingly vocal feminist critique of the tradition over the last 10 years or so. And so I wanted to pursue this, and really kind of the article that we're referencing here was in many ways an epilogue to my book. Although quite honestly, I will probably always be thinking about the Swastani tradition and follow it until my end of days, because it's become such an important part of my life and my research and my career. But in the research for this article, I drew on numerous conversations and interviews with several Nepali women who are mostly Newar women, so it's important to acknowledge that. And there were two overarching responses and interpretations of Shakti. On the one hand were feminists, in kind of the Euro-American sense of the word, who understood Shakti kind of, in their words, as autonomy, as mobility, as authority. So their kind of take on Shakti was very much, in my understanding of their words, very much influenced and aligned with kind of Euro-American notions of empowerment and power, right? Autonomy, mobility, authority, and so on. But there were also several Nepali women, and I should say for the feminists, they really were very strongly opposed to the Swastani tradition. They did not want to read it with their daughters or their sons. They had not read it in years. They saw it as a violation of human rights, a violation of girls' rights, as perpetuating various social ills such as child marriage. domestic violence, and so on and so forth. But then there were also a group of Nepali women for whom Shakti had a different interpretation. And they saw Shakti as a form of empowerment through devotion and through sacrifice, kind of the power to endure the suffering and hardship that so many Nepali women face, largely due to oppressive and asymmetrical social power structures that don't accord women equal status with men, right? And for those Nepali women, they saw in kind of notions of Shakti as presented through the Swastani examples for how to persevere and how to gain status and prestige kind of within the system, right? Within the existing social structures. So perhaps the feminists wanted to kind of blow up and rethink and redesign the current systems, right? Whereas this second group of Nepali women were working to figure out how to use the system to their advantage, and to make the most of the lot kind of given to them. And really, you know, it was very fascinating hearing these different takes on it. And in large part, what I wanted to kind of tease out through this article were these different interpretations of Shakti, of power and empowerment, and the idea that both of these interpretations are valid and they're very much context dependent. And that, you know, as an American white researcher, it is not fair or my place to impose my own notions of power and empowerment onto others. And really, I wanted to come at this kind of from the ground up. I wanted for the Nepali women that I interviewed to lead the discussion. And I think this is so important, and it really informs all of my work, particularly moving forward, because my work is increasingly ethnographically focused, is to let my interlocutors define the parameters of the conversation and to define the terms that they're using and their understanding of it, rather than imposing any pre-existing notions that I might have or my own worldview onto them, but to let them present their stories to me, and for me to then, you know, amplify those for others to learn from and to take into consideration.
Thanks, Jessica. Your work reminds me of Sabah Mahmood's work when you talk about this point of how some women are trying to gain power or authority within the existing structure, but you see what the feminists are trying to do is to try and subvert or dismantle the existing structures, which is maybe more so the case with queer activists, which then takes us to the other part of your work on the queer community and the sexual and gender minority communities within Nepal. You talk about these issues in a new way for us by relating queerness and queer community building to religion, secularization, ethnicity, and sexuality in modern Nepal. Can you tell us more about this new branch of your work and how all of these intersect in your study?
Sure. So I'm working on a new book-length project that builds on my more recent shift into the contemporary period and ethnographic research. And this project is tentatively titled Queer Kathmandu: Intersections of Religion, Secularism, Ethnicity, and Queerness in Nepal. I started this project shortly before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, which has complicated its progress since, as it's designed to be a place-based ethnographic study that really requires me to be on the ground in Nepal. But in any case, this project is motivated in part by two overarching considerations. So first, you know, scholarship on non-heterosexual and non-cisgendered bodies and identities in South Asia has historically been dominated by the figure of the Hijra, India's famed third gender or third sex people. And only recently has gender and sexuality scholarship started to expand beyond the Indian hijra to think about, hijras outside of India, so hijras in Pakistan and Bangladesh, as well as other forms of gender and sexuality in South Asia. But as of yet, Nepal still has not really figured into these discussions and discourses. So kind of once again, I find myself as a Nepal scholar wanting to shine some light on and bring Nepal into these conversations and to figure out, what things look like on the ground here in Nepal, although I'm not here in Nepal at the moment, but to add that to this larger puzzle that is South Asia. So, and then second, even within Nepal, gender and sexually minoritized communities have received little scholarly attention and really have to date only been subject of legal and human rights research. And although very important, of course, these reports on the queer community in Nepal focus rather squarely on the legal and human rights challenges and efforts of this community. And my project, in contrast, seeks to examine the daily lived experiences of queer Nepalis through an intersectional ethnographic study that prioritizes the role of everyday religion and ethnicity in queer lives. So what does it mean or look like to be, for example, a Muslim, transgender, or homosexual man in Nepal? Or what does it mean or look like to be a Hindu, transgender, or lesbian woman? Or a transgender, non-binary, or homosexual from this or that ethnic group, right? How does one's religious and or ethnic identity inform one's queer subjectivity? And how does one's queer subjectivity impact one's religious and or ethnic identity in practice, right? So these are some of the questions, but by no means all of the questions that I seek to address with this project. And, there's lots of different kind of arms or paths that lead off of this larger project that I hope to pursue through kind of smaller projects along the way. But really, I see this as an area of exploration that has not received enough attention within scholarship on Nepal, within scholarship on gender and sexuality in South Asia, within Hinduism. So there's a lot of different avenues through which to kind of look at this. But I really, again, because my background is as a feminist scholar of religion, I'm very interested in looking at how kind of the role of religion in the lives of queer people on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. You very kindly shared with us the article that you are working on, Nepal's Gai Jatra Parade, and also more recent Nepal Pride Parade. And in these papers, you draw a distinction between the first and second wave of queer organizing in Nepal. What are these two waves, and what are the major differences between them?
I guess one of the first aspects of this larger project that I've been working on is the intersection of religion and queerness in festival and ritual settings like Gai Jatra, Tej, Baitika, and so on. And so kind of I started thinking about Gai Jatra initially, and then looking at Nepal's two pride parades. So the first organized by the Blue Diamond Society that adopted Gai Jatra as its public platform, and the second organized by the Queer Youth Group and Queer Rights Collective that is a standalone pride parade during the International Pride Month of June. There's a clear generational difference between them. And, I would argue that this generational difference reflects, well, the different social and political contexts and landscapes out of which they emerged, right? So the Blue Diamond Society, as I understand it, chose Gai Jatra as a deeply entrenched local custom as thus a form through which the queer community could collectively come out from within Nepali culture. Gai Jatra served, in their view, as a means of kind of bringing the LGBT community out and into the public and to give them visibility. And by doing it through this culturally entrenched, validated local venue, it served as a way of legitimating LGBT identities because there were already elements of cross-dressing and merrymaking built into the annual festival, right? The newer generation of queer activists, in contrast, have adopted a decidedly secular stance and vocabulary in their activism and seek to delink the queer community from any single religious or cultural and particularly hegemonic discourse to be as inclusive and intersectional as possible to the whole queer community. And as I said, these actions and orientations of both sets of queer activists reflect the current moment in Nepal of their coming out and advocacy. So the first being in the early years of the 21st century, when Nepal was still a Hindu kingdom and identity politics were really just become the powerful movement it's been. And the latter has been only recently in the last 3 to 4 years during Nepal's formative period as a secular federal republic, which has also been a period of intense globalization and the development of queer and trans studies more internationally, right? And I do also want to note that I'm trying to be very cautious because I don't see these two generations of activism as in opposition to one another necessarily. More research needs to be done in that regard, but as two different articulations of queer activism that are, share the same goal of amplifying queer voices, increasing queer visibility, and destigmatizing and legally and culturally validating queer subjectivity. So at the end of the day, the goal in many ways is the same, but they're coming at it through kind of very different means and using different kinds of ideology and vocabulary to achieve that goal.
You've used different kinds of methods in doing historical research in Nepal, and you've moved on to more ethnographic methods now. But to talk about the historical methods of research in Nepal, what are the opportunities and challenges of doing such research in a context where maybe archival research might be difficult? And how have you found your way through them?
As you note, my work has increasingly moved away from the historical archival research more towards contemporary ethnographic work. But I'm trained as a textual scholar and still very much love archival work. I think there are ample opportunities to uncover or rediscover historical moments and materials and sensibilities because there's an incredible number of archival documents that have yet to be examined. And even those that have been examined may yield new insights when revisited through an intersectional or feminist lens, which is equally as exciting. As for the challenges, I think many remain the same today as they always are. Though I will note that thankfully load shedding no longer seems to be as major of an issue as it was back when I was doing the bulk of my archival work, which was definitely a challenge to time my visits to the archives accordingly. But but the challenges of trying to find the manuscripts that you're looking for, of trying to find other manuscripts that maybe you weren't looking for, and sifting through those that are too damaged to be of meaningful use, and so on, those remain the same. But Nepal has just an incredible archival resources available, and I'm always, it brings a smile to my face whenever I'm meeting with or hearing about other colleagues' work who study Hinduism in South Asia, who reference having gotten this or that text from an archive in Nepal. That, because it's not what I study, I had no idea that they had, right? So there's really, despite all the damaged manuscripts, which is part of just the nature of manuscripts that are really old, I think Nepal has actually done a really exemplary job of maintaining and preserving a lot of these textual resources. And honestly, many of the challenges are also the joys, right, of tracking down untouched or unpreserved resources, finding the right person to ask the right question that leads to more fantastic finds, right? And this is true also of ethnographic research, but both require time and patience and an openness to willingness to follow leads wherever they may or may not in fact lead. And one of my favorite memories of doing the research for my work on the Swastani was, I spend a lot of time in Sanku, which is where the public communal Brat is observed every Magh. And I spent a lot of time there, got to know a lot of locals, have really good friends and my Nepali family there. And one of my favorite memories is from the day when one of my friends who I talked with regularly about the Swastani tradition, when he asked me if I wanted to see his family's Swasthanivratakatha text. And of course I said yes. And he rummaged around under his bed to find it and pulled out this plastic bag that contained this wrapped text in it. And he said, take it, go look at it, just bring it back whenever. And so I did. And when I took it back to the room that I was renting and opened it up and looked at it, the text was from 1764. And that was, as someone who's studying text and history, remains such a memorable moment, because here, history can be found in the most unexpected of places. Here was this very well maintained Swastani text from 1764, which just blew my mind, casually kept under my friend's bed, and so I think it's kind of that was a real treasure, literally, and just kind of the whole experience was a good reminder that we need to, that history can be found in all sorts of places, that answers and more questions that lead to more interesting questions and answers come from unexpected places and times and sources. So there's a lot of cool things about doing, historical research as well as contemporary research.
We've now come to the end of our conversation today. But before we go, would you like to add anything or highlight as the key takeaway of your work?
First and foremost, thank you for having me here to talk about my work and how it connects with discussions about gender in Nepal. It's really interesting to see how the parameters of these conversations have expanded from focusing more squarely on women to now thinking about gender in much broader terms. In my earlier work on the Svasthani tradition, my current project on Nepal's queer community really reflect this trajectory and evolution and kind of growth in these discussions. So much has changed in some respects, on the one hand, but yet at the same time, it's also quite remarkable how little has changed in other respects. Patriarchy runs deep in Nepal, as it does seemingly wherever it gains hold. But it is heartening, I think, to see the energy and commitment of many activists and just everyday women and men and people of differing gender identities who are working on behalf of these different communities and minoritized groups. And one thing I'd like to note is the increased attention to intersectionality in discussions of gender. From my perspective, religion remains a really important aspect of daily lived experience for many Nepalis, even if that's through a rejection of religion, which we may see more of as Nepal increasingly grapples with and experiences secularization. And this remains especially true, I think, for women who are generally more closely linked with the religious welfare of their families. So as I've noted, I'll be interested to see what role religion plays in the lives and activism of queer Nepalis, whose subjectivity is necessarily informed by not only their gender and sexual identities, but by their religious and ethnic communities and orientations. So I think the kinds of questions remain fundamentally the same, but we keep adding greater nuance to these questions and expanding them and applying them to new situations. And also need to reflect back on kind of the origins of a lot of these questions and to listen to people on the ground and the kind of questions that they're asking themselves and people of their communities and the things that they want to talk about. So clearly, there's much more that can be said. And I do look forward to continuing these kinds of conversations through other outlets and avenues. But one last thing that I maybe should mention is that for anyone who's listening, who's interested in reading the Swasthanivratakatha, but who might not read Nepali well, I'm currently working together with my collaborator, Dr. Alaka Chudala from the University of Vienna, on an English translation of the Swasthanikatha. And this is funded by an NEH Scholarly Editions and Translation Grant and will be published sometime after it's complete by Oxford University Press. So thank you again, Uma and Kumud. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This was an absolutely eye-opening conversation for me. So thank you so much and really appreciate your time for this podcast. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. This was really interesting. Thank you.